10.
Read.
Will ya? Educate your damn self.
Performance is the way where you learn how things resonate inside of you, where you learn how to process your own feelings, your own aspirations. Performance is where you can jam together with the community and learn how the community jams together. Those are the things that are important about how we're going to do social justice, because without those things, people won't come together.
Welcome to Black Manifesto, the 10 Commandments. Black Women Speak Out, a podcast series hosted by Nora, chipaumire, and myself, Pawlet Brookes. Black Manifesto brings together voices of Black women from around the world as a collective conversation, making the invisible visible and addressing how we work to reshape a new world in which Black women are seen and heard. The guests on this podcast share their reflections unapologetically, so please be aware of uses of strong language and references to personal struggles and traumas. In this episode, Anita Gonzalez offers her reflections on international collaboration, racial justice, and what self-education looks like as we explore the 10th and final commandment. Read, will ya? Educate your darn self. I'm going to jump straight in and ask you what books, essays, journals have influenced your work and your practice.
Well, Paula, I'm a part of a group called Black Performance Theory. And so a lot of the writings of the people in that group have influenced me tremendously. Black Performance Theory it was founded by Tommy DeFrance and Richard Green many years ago. So in the group are people like Melissa and E. Patrick Johnson. So all of their writings have influenced me because together we've been able to think about what it means to think about Black performance, not as related to skin color, but as related to aesthetic. So it was actually the conversations within that group of Black performance theory that allowed us to come together and create that volume, Black Performance Theory. Another person who influences me a lot is a woman named Doreen Kondo. And I studied her when I was in graduate school, but I haven't really returned to her writings until lately when I'm working on my own book manuscript about mariners, Black mariners. But she talks about the concept of crafting selves, how people take elements of their environment and they use them in order to create their identities, in order to kind of demonstrate how they manifest in the world. And I know those are two kind of esoteric thoughts, but those are people who have influenced me in terms of scholarship, reading, writing.
And so the sort of scholarship and reading and writing, this summer you're joining the Georgetown College and becoming the co-lead at the university's new Racial Justice Institute. Why do you think then that Black arts and Black dance are important tools in education and self-education? And what power exists in performance practice?
The power of embodiment, right? Like, I think that people think that you only learn from books. How could you possibly just learn from books? Performance is the way where you learn how things resonate inside of you, where you learn how to process your own feelings, your own aspirations. Performance is where you can jam together with the community and learn how the community jams together. Those are the things that are important about how we're going to do social justice, because without those things, people won't come together. I mean, I talk all the time with that group about how the other people in that collective is a lawyer and someone who's in public health and eventually someone in public policy. But all of those things have no physical manifestation without performance. Like, what does it look like when you talk about a concept like criminal justice? It looks like a person who's been incarcerated. It looks like someone who has a song and a dance and is no longer able to share that with their family. That's why arts are important, because it creates the human face to all the things we want to seek in terms of social justice.
Wow. So why do you think that art and performance is important in driving the conversation around racial justice and social change then? So we've talked about embodiment. So why is it important in terms of the conversation? And how do you champion empowerment when navigating these conversations?
So I go on my little soapbox and I talk a lot about what is art. I find that in the people who I'm meeting with, they have not thought about art as carrying history. They don't think about storytelling. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about storytelling, and the stories of the people who haven't been heard are the stories we need to hear in order to achieve justice. We can't assume it's just one story. There's many, many stories, and each story together creates a tapestry of what the world is. Historically, it's been the right of the conqueror to tell the story. But once you start to hear the stories of all other people's perspectives on it, it creates a whole different panorama. Like, I give a good example. One of the things I'm working on is this mariner thing. There's a story about Parry, who went to the North Pole and his ships got stuck in the ice. And he stayed there and he wrote in his journals, and the men wrote in his journals, and they did all these shows and everything. And it was all about Parry stuck in the ice. And I had a student who was writing an art piece based on Parry stuck in the ice. I talked to her, and she was like, in his journals, he talks about this man with a shovel. And I don't know what that's about, this man with a shovel, and they killed him because he was one of the indigenous people. And I said, well, do you know anything about what the indigenous people said about that? And she was like, oh, and she went to the North Pole. She went to the North Pole and she met the Inuit, and they have all of these archives about what happened when this white guy came and killed this guy over some piece of metal that meant nothing. And then they have collected all of the little things the men have left there and made them into things like knives in order to kill whales. She found this whole archive of knowledge from the Inuit perspective of what had happened when Parry had been there. And that's what I mean. That's the other story. For them, there was these weird ships that got stuck with these strange men who would kill a man over a shovel. And when they died, because they didn't know how to survive, they took all of this stuff on their boat and made them into utensils that were actually useful in the Arctic.
That's why these podcasts are really important, because they're telling other stories and putting other voices forward. And in your work, you talk very much about interdisciplinary and including pioneering in work around digital technology. Why do you think it's important to foster interdisciplinary practice? And what role do you think that technology plays in innovation of the future of new work?
So those are two different questions for me. The reason I do work with technology is because you want to reach as many audiences as possible. I mean, I think when you're bothering with telling a story, or because your story is essential for people to understand how the world functions, you should tell it as many times in as many ways as you possibly can, in as many different variations. You know, there's the story of the African griot, and when they tell the story, they don't tell the story the same way. Every time they tell the story, they consider the audience and they tell the story a different way so that it will have meaning and impact to the person they're communicating with. And I feel that that's what you can do with digital technologies. I mean, it's so funny. I'm very excited about Georgetown and working with this collective of Black scholars to tell a story. And that's a particular way to tell the story. I also do lectures on cruise ships, people who are on vacation. And I'm still going to tell them the story about how reggae is protest music, right? Because that's what we're doing, right? It's the same story told a million different ways. If I can tell it digitally so that younger people or older people or more people will get it, I'm very excited. You know, I just started this MOOC, Black Performance and Social Protest. And of course, I saw that the Storytelling for Social Change MOOC reached 40,000 people. And I thought, wow, I am so doing one about Black performance and protest, because we need to tell the story that way too. I experiment with technologies because, first of all, I like learning new things. And then second of all, I think it's important to tell the story in as many different ways as forms as possible. And thirdly, because when I'm crafting something, like when I'm writing a play or something, it helps me to tell the story in different ways so I can think about how to actually craft it into something that will have meaning back on the theatrical stage. Because the other thing about storytelling, of course, is that I think too often we have a presumed audience. We assume it's for, I don't know, a middle-class, gray-haired white audience or for an all-Black community. We don't really know what the audience is thinking unless you're in dialogue with them. And by telling the story multiple ways to multiple audiences, I can better understand what is the most impactful part of the story and how it makes meaning for different people in different ways.
Also, people are not one-dimensional. So, they access things in different ways. So telling the story in different ways is also very, very useful, which is the way in which we've been modelling the festival in terms of telling, dance in different ways. But continuing on, you've contributed and edited several publications about Black dance and performance. Can you tell us about the importance of documentation and writing about Black dance and performance?
Because the archive only has in it mostly white people's perspective, because we are an oral people who like to perform and be in community and do embodiment like many other Indigenous communities around the world. We haven't prioritized the written word. So the people who've prioritized the written word have written things, and the things are inaccurate. They're not based in spirituality. They're not based in a sense of community practice. They're not based in an embodied understanding of the practice itself. They don't know the cultures that they're writing about. So we must write our own stories.
You've also worked around the world in terms of places like Ethiopia, South Africa, Mexico, Liverpool in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you have worked on, and what wealth do you find in these international connections?
Oh, it teaches me different ways of looking at histories and stories. For example, Ethiopia. I enjoyed working there because we tend to frame our conversations around colonialism, and Ethiopia is a country that has never been colonized. The way that they talk about their history is completely different. I was working with them on a project of writing their history. So they're again an oral culture, but they have a huge theater department. It's 300 majors. And in their theater department, they have faculty who are all practitioners as well as scholars. And they were interested in writing their history of theater in their country, speaking to the rest of the world about what goes on in their country. So I went with them and we had a big seminar where we talked about how do you write a history that's in Amharic and that's 3,000 years old. So they've been doing theater for 3,000 years. They're the descendants of Solomon in their history. And so we talked about, first of all, why do you want to tell the rest of the world the history? And then what do you want to tell them about your history? And that conversation led to all kinds of wonderful things, like because of the way that they thought about gender, for example. Women have only been on the stage in Ethiopia since 1982. And then they were saying that they didn't believe in gender. They didn't believe that gender could be fluid. And I said, well, what was happening when you were playing the women in the plays on stage for the rest of the 2,000 years? Isn't that playing with gender? And so it was really interesting to have the conversation with the women about gender too. I learned a lot in that dialogue. And where we left, because it was the last thing I did before COVID, where we left at the end of that was that we would continue the discussion of musicals, because they wanted to write musicals telling their history as well. And they said they wanted to hear about Western forms. And I'm partly like, why is that important? But partly it's important in the same way that you and I are talking about why do international exchange, because they will see what other models people have in other countries and then decide for themselves if that's relevant to the way they want to tell their stories. And to me, that's the kind of work I find the most fascinating, right? That kind of dialogue and exchange that happens across communities teaches people on both sides of the water a lot of things. In South Africa, I was working with Mikalisi Masalela. And again, in this case, we were trying to identify issues that were common to both countries that we wanted to make theatrical shows about. Again, COVID interrupted a lot of things, but we were working on a production of a play called Flint by a man named Jose Casas. And in that play, he's talking about the Flint water crisis. But of course, South Africa is also undergoing a huge water crisis. And so we were going to bring in Mikalisi to direct the production of Flint and then take it to the National Arts Festival in South Africa so that they could talk about the issue of water, which is a global issue from that perspective. So those kind of collaborative works are what I most prefer to do. I went to South Africa a few times. First you talk about educate your damn self. I was trying to educate my chair that there was theater in other countries that were Black. I know that sounds silly, but she thought that there was like not really, like whatever it is Anita does, there's not really theater in like South Africa or Africa, right? And I took my boss, I literally said, look, let's just go and we'll see what they're doing in South Africa. I want you to see that they do opera, they do theater, they perform all kinds of performing arts exist in South Africa. And you know what the really sad thing about that trip was? She had cultural dislocation and she just wanted to see the penguins.
Yeah, I think that is a great example because I think it's what Black arts is constantly going through, in that people don't want to admit that there's work happening, real quality work. It's not community, it's not just folksy, it's not folkloric, but there's quality work happening internationally in Black countries. And it's almost like, as you say, they put these blinkers up and then there's something else more interesting.
The day we were supposed to go to the Cape Town Opera rehearsal of the Mandela opera that they did, she said that she booked a tour. And I was like, but we were here to see the opera. They are inviting us to rehearsal. And she's like, okay.
Yeah, I think getting her to go was the thing. Getting her to really engage, then that was never really going to happen, because then they'd have to admit that you're right if they really engaged. So deflection on penguins, much more interesting. However, why is collaboration important?
Because again, it's a place where you can do that embodied exchange, right? I see you, you see me, we see each other. and what can we make together? I mean, that's what I get from collaboration. And also, when I'm making theatrical work, it's to be able to see multiple voices in the room, right? Again, because there's no point in telling a story if it's not relevant. So I use collaboration as a way of getting multiple voices in the room. And often they are voices that would never be in the same room together, which is even more interesting because they have to have some kind of dialogue. I mean, it's so funny, my relationship with your country, with England. I was doing a piece. This was insane, Pawlet. I was doing a piece about Black and Latino migrations in the Midwest. And I asked one of your white composers, Jonathan Gerling, to compose the music for me. Now, why did I do that? That made no sense. He knew nothing at all. He had never been to the United States. But in the process of working on that musical, because he was bringing what he knew about how to create music with actors' bodies, because he works further than that, Royal Shakespeare, right? I mean, his skill is that he already does embodied performance because he's using theatrical forms in music. But bringing him into Chicago and into the Black neighborhoods of Chicago and the Chicano neighborhoods of Chicago was a really interesting dialogue, right? Because he asked questions like I would never have thought about. Like we saw a piece by Kyle Abrams or somebody like that. And Kyle was performing, and it was like a show about the criminal justice system. And he said, how come the only white guy there is the bad guy? And I thought, I don't even know how to answer that question. Like, what kind of question? He's like, I don't think it's fair to the white guy that he's the bad guy. And I was like, but he is. And he had other observations about America, like when we were showing him Chicago, because I was with Joel Valentin Martinez. He was my co-director, co-collaborator on this, so that we could have Black and Latino together. And when we went through the neighborhood, I remember Jonathan said, how come there's only all Black people in this neighborhood? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we have neighborhoods with Blacks in them in England, but we don't have like all Black neighborhoods. And I was like, well, this is because of Midwestern segregation. I find that I had to explain the whole system of redlining and segregation because we are so ingrained in thinking about it. Of course, there's all Black neighborhoods and all Mexican neighborhoods and all white neighborhoods. But by bringing in someone who was working within a different cultural community, which in this case happened to be the UK, his perspective of it is different because inequality works differently.
But I also think the perspective is different in terms of the issue around race. I think there's is deluded because the Black neighborhoods, they were gentrified. People were moved out of their communities. So you didn't have all Black communities anymore. And, you know, so that was part of a program of work that started happening in the mid 70s, early 80s. No one ever talks about it, but, you know, people moved out onto estates. And before you know it, the areas that were the ghettos are now the areas that were close to the cities. So they've been gentrified. And so it's his limited knowledge of his own country as well.
Right. So this is where the educate your damn self comes from, right?
Exactly.
Because you have to educate yourself. So the answer is you have to educate yourself by collaborating with other people as well as by reading books. Educating yourself from books is one way, but the other way of educating yourself is putting yourself in uncomfortable positions, putting people in rooms who don't go together, and seeing what kind of knowledge they can exchange with one another in order to bring about change in the world.
So justice, legacy, and dialogue. What do these three words mean to you?
So justice is about leveling the playing field. It's so funny. Our first meetings of the Racial Justice Institute were last week, and we spent a day teasing out those three terms, racial, justice, and institute. And we didn't really come to a common agreement about it, but we talked about justice as a process. We talked about they have that cartoon where you talk about inequality, and people are standing on different size blocks. My colleague Derek found another one where all of them were standing on a different block that had been completely reconstructed. So we ended up talking about justice as being, you actually have to deconstruct, dismantle structures in order to create justice. And that the dismantling of structures is a process. But until the structures that are creating inequality are dismantled, you can't achieve justice. That's as far as we got in this interdisciplinary conversation.
And legacy?
Legacy. It's what you leave behind so that the youngins can move forward.
And dialogue?
And dialogue? Dialogue is an exchange of stories.
So what does recognition look like for you then?
Oh, I don't know. You know, when you're young, recognition means getting into the biggest theater, right? But now I think recognition is just knowing that you have something to leave behind. Recognition is having a legacy that people care about.
So what is the force that drives you every day as an educator, as a teacher?
As an educator, oh, those faces, right? I mean, the students and I'm a teacher. Many teachers are teachers because they want to give something to the students. And I'm a teacher because I want to hear what the students are going to tell me about how they're going to change the world.
Yeah.
That's what I do with every conversation with students. I ask them, so what are you going to do to change the world? Because I'm excited. Tell me how to do it. How can I help?
Okay. And then finally, as is now a tradition in this series, what is the life lessons that you want to share with others?
It's that thing about the glass ceiling, because others I'm thinking about primarily people of color. And I think that within the world, the way it is now, they're going to hit glass ceilings. And that when they hit those glass ceilings, they have to not keep pushing against the ceiling because they will become depressed and demoralized. They need to move over, leave the job, leave the space, and find another place where the ceiling is a little higher. And if they can keep doing that in their lives, they'll be able to achieve. That's one lesson. I guess the other lesson is one that was told to me by a therapist. I had a time when I was crying every day and I couldn't understand it. I'd go to work, I'd cry. And she said, Anita, you know what you need to do? Make sure that every week, at least once, maybe twice, you are in the room with people who are really exciting to you, people who are exchanging exciting ideas. They can be students, they can be colleagues, but if you're in a room where you're just unhappy and zoning out, which almost all of us are at some time, make sure that you're finding a space where there are people who you like talking to, people who inspire you and teach you to be creative. And it was such a lesson for me. I really learned a lot by that because I was something I could implement right away. I could bring together 3 people I wanted to talk to, or I could go to another city and just make sure that happened every day in your week, because that's what will give you joy. You can't go through a life of duty. You have to find a place where you find people who are exciting. You having it when you have these conversations, right?
I do. I feel very, very blessed in that I meet people from all over the world, make connections, make friendships, and it's just magical to be able to do that and have those conversations.
Thank you for listening. You can read more about Black Manifesto in Black Ink, a new publication from Serendipity, which brings together international voices from Africa and the African Caribbean diaspora and Indigenous communities to discuss Black arts, heritage and cultural politics. The next edition of Black Ink will be released in October 2021. The Black Manifesto podcast is sponsored by the National Education Union. This podcast was edited by Hannah Hethman and Julia Letts at Better Lemon Creative Audio, with research by Mistora Allison and Amy Grain. In the spirit of this episode, if you're looking for more information and content to support your own learning, visit our Resources for Change pages at serendipity-uk.com for links to podcasts and publications and education packs.